Help! Somebody help me!
Leave her alone or I shut you now.
Hello everyone, welcome to Afro-Korean Stories, Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. My dream is to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of this year. I believe together we can achieve. The blade pressed cold against her throat, but Amara couldn't breathe for an entirely different reason. The man holding her captor at gunpoint across the dim warehouse had eyes like midnight storms, beautiful and deadly, locked on her with an intensity that made her forget the danger completely. Something ancient and inevitable awakened between them in that suspended moment, recognition without reason, hunger without logic, and when he spoke, his voice was silk over steel. Mine. The word should have terrified her. Instead, her body answered with heat that had nothing to do with fear. Welcome to Afro-Korean Stories, Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. Kang Min-ho had built his empire on calculated decisions and absolute control, yet nothing had prepared him for the sight of her, curse-like sin wrapped in an ill-fitting waitress uniform, trapped in his enemy's grasp because she'd witnessed a transaction she shouldn't have seen. He'd come to eliminate a problem and found something far more dangerous instead, a woman whose terror-bright eyes held defiance even with a blade at her pulse, whose full lips trembled not with submission but barely restrained fury, whose presence in his world rewrote every rule he'd spent 32 years perfecting. The gun in his hand felt inadequate suddenly, insufficient for the protection she required, the claim his body was already making without his permission. His second-in-command shifted beside him but Min-ho barely registered the movement, every cell focused on Amara with predatory precision, tracking the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the way her captor's hand bruised her upper arm, the tear in her uniform that revealed smooth dark skin he needed to taste with an urgency that bordered on violence. She was terrified, trapped, completely at another man's mercy, and something primitive in Min-ho's chest roared possession so absolute he forgot they were strangers, forgot she didn't know his name, forgot everything except the fundamental truth that she belonged to him and anyone who touched her forfeited their right to breathe. Let her go. His Korean was clipped, deadly, leaving no room for negotiation. The warehouse went silent, 20 men on both sides understanding they'd just witnessed their boss cross a line he'd never approached before, showing emotion over a random woman, revealing weakness when he'd built his reputation on having none. Amara felt the tension shift, felt the blade press harder in response, felt her captor's laugh vibrate against her back, but her eyes stayed locked on the stranger whose gaze promised retribution and protection in equal measure, whose mere presence made her body hum with awareness she'd never experienced, whose obvious interest in her survival should have been irrelevant yet felt like the only thing that mattered in a world suddenly tilted sideways. She'd taken the hostess job at the upscale restaurant to pay medical bills, had stayed late to help with inventory, had walked in on the private room transaction by accident, drugs, and money and men with guns, and before she could retreat one of them had grabbed her, dragged her here, used her as insurance against whatever business deal had clearly gone wrong. She should be focused on survival, on escape, on anything except the way her body responded to a stranger's attention, yet here she was, 30 seconds from potential death, feeling heat pool low in her belly because a dangerous man was looking at her like she was oxygen and he'd been drowning. The standoff stretched, seconds becoming minutes, tension coiling tighter until it had to snap, and when it did everything happened at once. Min-ho moved with speed that shouldn't have been possible, gun firing twice, knife appearing from nowhere, and suddenly Amara was falling, the blade at her throat gone, her captor crumpling behind her, and then strong arms caught her, steadied her, pulled her against a chest that felt like safety despite belonging to a man who'd just killed without hesitation. She should run, should scream, should do anything except melt into his hold, but her body had other ideas entirely, trembling not with fear now but with something far more dangerous, awareness of hard muscle beneath expensive fabric, expensive cologne mixing with gunpowder, large hands that held her gently despite their obvious capacity for violence. Her knees gave out and he simply lifted her, one arm beneath her thighs, the other supporting her back, cradling her against him like she weighed nothing despite her curves, and Amara heard herself make a sound that was half sob half something else entirely. You're safe. The words were Korean but his tone transcended language, promise, and possession and something darker threading through syllables that made her shiver. She didn't speak Korean, had only been in Seoul 3 months, teaching English while trying to save money, trying to build something better than the poverty she'd escaped back home, and now she was being held by a man whose name she didn't know in the aftermath of violence she'd witnessed, and nothing about this made sense except the way his heartbeat felt steady against her ear, the way his grip tightened when she shifted, the way his jaw clenched when she looked up at him. Beautiful. The English word seemed torn from him involuntarily, his accent thick, his eyes roaming her face like he was memorizing features, and Amara felt heat flood her cheeks, felt awareness spike higher, felt something fundamental shift in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the magnetic pull between them that defied logic entirely. The warehouse erupted into organized chaos around them, men moving with military precision, evidence being collected, bodies being removed, and through it all Minho stood unmoved, still holding her, still looking at her like she'd appeared from his dreams, still radiating possessive protection that should have alarmed her but instead made her feel cherished in a way she'd never experienced. His men gave them space, shooting curious glances, clearly shocked by their boss's behavior, and Amara registered dimly that this wasn't normal, that whatever was happening between them violated protocol she didn't understand, that she should probably be more concerned about the danger she'd witnessed than the way the stranger's thumb was now stroking absent patterns on her thigh where her skirt had ridden up. Name. One word, command softened by something almost desperate, and she found herself answering before thinking better of it, before remembering she shouldn't give information to dangerous men, before logic could override the pull between them. Amara. Her voice came out breathier than intended, affected by proximity and adrenaline and the way his eyes darkened when she spoke. He repeated it, the syllables transformed by his accent into something almost sacred, and then he was moving, carrying her toward black SUVs that screamed wealth and power, his security falling into formation around them, and she should protest, should demand to be released, should insist on calling police except she'd just watched him kill 2 men and knew instinctively that he was the law here. That his power superseded badges and courts, that she'd stumbled into a world where normal rules didn't apply. The vehicle interior was luxury incarnate, leather and technology, tinted windows that blocked out reality, and when he finally set her down on the seat he didn't retreat, instead crowding into her space, one hand coming up to cup her jaw, tilting her face toward his, and Amara's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze, hunger and possessiveness and something almost reverent warring for dominance. Mine. The word again, this time in English, his accent making it sound like prayer and threat combined, and Amara should argue, should tell him she belonged to herself, should maintain boundaries, but instead she felt her body lean toward him, felt her lips part on an inhale that drew his scent deeper, felt heat coil tighter in her core when his thumb brushed across her lower lip with pressure that promised more. Hospital. He switched back to Korean, addressing someone she couldn't see. And then they were moving, the city sliding past windows, and Amara tried to organize her thoughts, tried to understand what was happening, tried to reconcile the danger she'd witnessed with the way this man was now examining her for injuries with hands that shook slightly, betraying emotion beneath his controlled exterior. She wasn't hurt, not really, just bruised and terrified and overwhelmingly aware of him, but he seemed unconvinced, fingers ghosting over every visible mark, jaw clenching tighter with each discovered bruise, rage simmering beneath his surface that should scare her but instead made her feel protected. Later that night, after doctors had examined her despite her protests, after police had taken her statement while Minho's lawyer ensured certain details stayed vague, after she'd been installed in a luxury hotel suite with security posted outside her door, Amara finally had space to process, to panic, to understand how completely her life had just derailed. She should be grateful for the protection, should accept the generous payment his people had offered for her trouble, should distance herself from whatever this was, but instead she found herself staring at the business card he'd pressed into her palm before leaving, raised print spelling out his name and title, CEO of Kong Industries, but everyone knew that was cover for something darker, something the news whispered about but couldn't prove, Korean Mafia royalty wrapped in legitimate business. Power that answered to no one. She should throw the card away, should block the number already programmed into the new phone his assistant had provided, should flee back to her tiny apartment and pretend this night never happened, but her fingers kept tracing his name, kept remembering the way he'd looked at her, kept feeling phantom warmth where his hands had touched, and she knew with absolute certainty that whatever had started in that warehouse wasn't finished, that something had been set in motion neither of them could stop even if they wanted to. The following morning brought flowers, hundreds of them, transforming her hotel suite into a garden, and tucked among the roses was a note in precise handwriting. "Forgive me for putting you in danger. Let me make it right." The words were simple, but the implication was anything but, because making it right meant continued contact, meant accepting his protection, meant acknowledging the connection that had sparked between them in violence and terror, meant opening her life to a man whose world could destroy her. Amara stood among the blooms, their scent overwhelming, their beauty excessive, and felt tears threaten because no one had ever made such a gesture for her, no one had ever cared enough to try, and she hated that it touched her, hated that it mattered, hated that she wanted to call the number on his card and hear his voice again despite knowing she should run instead. Her phone rang as if summoned by her thoughts, unknown number, but she knew, somehow she knew, and her hand trembled slightly as she answered, pressing the device to her ear, holding her breath for what came next. "You haven't left." Minho's voice was silken satisfaction, no greeting, just statement of fact, and Amara felt heat flood her system at the proof he'd been watching, protecting, caring about her movements even from distance. She should be angry about the surveillance, should demand privacy, should set boundaries, but instead she found herself asking the question that had haunted her all night. "Why me?" Silence stretched, long enough she thought he might not answer, and then his voice came through low and honest in a way that stole her breath. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." The promise in those words made her shiver, made her core clench, made her lean against the window for support because she was reacting to him through a phone, through mere voice, with intensity that defied reason. She'd had boyfriends before, safe boring men who'd never made her feel a fraction of what this dangerous stranger evoked with syllables, who'd never looked at her curves with appreciation rather than judgment, who'd never made her believe she was someone worth protecting at any cost. The conversation should have been brief, polite, a wealthy man checking on a woman he'd rescued, but instead it stretched, minutes becoming an hour, him asking about her life with genuine interest, her answering with honesty that surprised her, and somewhere in that exchange something shifted, moved from strangers to something more undefined but undeniable, connection that had no logical foundation but felt inevitable anyway. He told her about growing up between two worlds, Korean tradition and international business, expectations that crushed rather than guided, and she heard loneliness in his words despite the power he wielded, understood what it cost to be untouchable, related because she'd been invisible her whole life, curvy black girl from nowhere with nothing, told she'd never matter, never succeed, never be chosen by anyone who mattered. They were opposites in every way except the ones that counted, isolation wearing different faces, hunger for connection hidden beneath protective shells, and by the time she finally ended the call her resistance had cracked, not broken but definitely compromised, because he'd made her feel seen in ways no one ever had. That evening he appeared at her door, unannounced but somehow expected, dressed casually in ways that should have made him less dangerous but somehow achieved the opposite, jeans that showed powerful thighs, black shirt that emphasized broad shoulders, and when she opened the door his eyes roamed her body with hunger he didn't bother hiding, taking in the simple dress she'd changed into, the way it hugged her curves, the skin left bare, and his jaw clenched with obvious desire that made her breath catch. "Dinner." One word, not quite question, but his eyes asked permission even as his body language screamed command, and Amara knew she should refuse, should maintain distance, should protect herself from whatever this was becoming, but instead she found herself nodding, grabbing her purse, letting him guide her to the elevator with a hand at her lower back that burned through fabric, proprietary and possessive and somehow exactly right. The restaurant was exclusive, the kind that didn't take reservations from normal people, and staff treated him with deference that confirmed his power, but he seemed to forget everyone else the moment they were seated, attention fixed on her with intensity that made her squirm, made her aware of every inch of her body, made her wish she'd worn something more modest or maybe less because his gaze felt like physical touch. He ordered in Korean, rapid conversation with their server, and Amara felt out of depth, reminded that she was in his world, dependent on his translation, vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical. But then he switched to English, asking about her preferences, adjusting orders based on her answers, and the consideration gentled something in her chest even as his continued attention kept her on edge. The food was incredible, course after course, and he watched her eat with satisfaction that bordered on indecent, clearly pleased by her enjoyment, clearly affected by the small sounds she made when flavors hit her tongue, clearly fighting urges she could see in the tension of his shoulders, the whiteness of his knuckles on his wine glass, the way his eyes kept dropping to her mouth. They talked between courses, conversation flowing easier now, him asking about her family, her dreams, her plans, and she found herself opening up in ways she'd never done with anyone, telling him about growing up poor, about her mother's death, about escaping to Seoul to build something better, about feeling lost more often than found, and he listened like every word mattered, like she mattered, and that attention was more intoxicating than any wine. By the end of the week she'd seen him 4 more times, always his initiation, always generous gestures that should have felt like obligation but somehow didn't, flowers arriving daily, her hotel suite upgraded twice, her teaching schedule mysteriously cleared of evening classes, and she should ask how he knew, should protest the intervention, but instead she found herself anticipating his calls, his visits, his attention that made her feel precious rather than burdensome. Her roommate called, worried about her absence, and Amara struggled to explain, struggled to put into words what was happening, struggled to justify staying in a luxury hotel being courted by a dangerous man she barely knew, but even as she tried to articulate concerns she couldn't make herself care enough to leave, couldn't make herself walk away from the way he looked at her, touched her, made her believe she was someone worth protecting, worth wanting, worth choosing above everything else. The following morning brought crisis in the form of a news alert on her phone, photos of her entering his vehicle, leaving his restaurant, walking beside him through the hotel lobby, and the accompanying article was brutal, speculation about his latest conquest, questions about whether he was targeting foreign women, implications that she was either gold digger or victim, and the public judgment cut deeper than expected, especially the comments about her appearance, her weight, her obvious unsuitability for a man of his status. She should have expected this, should have known their connection couldn't stay private, should have been prepared for scrutiny, but seeing herself reduced to speculation and insult made her nauseous, made her remember every cruel thing she'd ever been told about her body, made her doubt everything about the past week. Her phone rang, Minho's number, but she couldn't answer, couldn't face his pity or worse his confirmation that the public was right, that whatever this was couldn't survive reality, that she'd been foolish to believe someone like him could want someone like her beyond novelty or fetish. The knock on her door came 30 minutes later, forceful enough she knew who it was before looking through the peephole, and part of her wanted to hide, wanted to avoid this conversation, but she'd never been a coward so she opened it to find him standing there, fury radiating from every line of his body, phone clenched in one hand, jaw so tight she could see muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Are you hurt?" The question emerged harsh, English strained by emotion, and Amara blinked at him, confused by what he was asking until his free hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing beneath her eye like checking for tears. "The article," she said uselessly, gesturing toward where her phone lay discarded, and his expression went absolutely lethal, the kind of cold rage that promised consequences she couldn't imagine. "I've already handled it." His voice was flat, final, promise of retribution that should probably concern her but instead made relief flood her system. "The publication will print a retraction and apology by tonight, the photographer won't work in this city again, and the editor will be looking for new employment before the week ends," and there was something in his absolute certainty, his casual destruction of careers and reputations, that should have terrified her but instead made her feel protected, made her understand that his power wasn't just theoretical, that he wielded it without hesitation when something he cared about was threatened. That she had somehow become something he cared about. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, but his expression told her he absolutely had, that there was no universe where he allowed her to be attacked and didn't respond with overwhelming force, that protection wasn't optional with him but fundamental. They stood in her doorway, his hands still on her face, heat building between them that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with proximity, with the way his eyes kept dropping to her mouth, with the way her body was leaning toward his without permission, with the magnetic pull that had existed from the first moment intensifying with every encounter. "Kiss me." The words escaped before she could stop them, breathless and bold and exactly what she wanted despite knowing they crossed every line they'd been dancing around, and his response was immediate, one hand sliding into her hair, the other gripping her hip, and then his mouth was on hers, consuming and claiming and absolutely devastating, and Amara's entire world narrowed to sensation, to taste, to the way he kissed like he'd been starving for her specifically, to the way her curves pressed against hard muscle, to the way his tongue swept into her mouth with confidence that made her knees weak. The kiss went on forever, not long enough, breaking only when air became necessary, and then they were moving, stumbling into her suite, door kicking shut behind them, and his hands were everywhere, learning her curves with reverence that made her burn, and clothes started disappearing, and she should stop this, should think about consequences, should maintain some boundary, but his mouth on her neck destroyed rational thought. His praise in Korean and English made her arch into his touch, his obvious appreciation for her body exactly as it was made her bold in ways she'd never been before. The rest happened in fragments burned into memory, his careful preparation, his constant checking for consent, his absolute focus on her pleasure before his own, and when they finally came together it was overwhelming, perfect, absolutely right in ways that transcended physical connection forged through vulnerability and trust and desire that felt inevitable rather than rushed. Afterward he held her, pulled her against his chest, and she felt tears threaten because no one had ever looked at her the way he did, like she was miracle rather than burden, like she was choice rather than compromise, like she was enough exactly as she was. The following morning she woke alone, momentary panic until she heard him in the other room, voice low and deadly in Korean, clearly conducting business that reminded her who he was, what he did, the danger that surrounded him like atmosphere, and fear crept in, not of him but of the life he represented, the violence she'd witnessed, the enemies he must have, the thousand ways this could go wrong. She should leave before he finished his call, should distance herself while she still could, should protect her heart before it was too late, but even as she thought it she knew the truth, it was already too late, she was already falling, maybe had been since that first moment in the warehouse when he'd looked at her like she was worth burning the world for, and now she had to decide whether to jump or retreat, whether to trust this impossible connection or run from it. The choice should have been obvious, self-preservation dictated distance, but as he appeared in the doorway, phone call finished, expression softening when he saw her awake, moving toward her with purpose and possession and something almost tender, she knew she wasn't going anywhere. A few days later crisis arrived in the form of an ambush, car forced off the road while she was returning from teaching, men appearing from nowhere, and terror spiked through her system because she recognized the faces from the warehouse, understood this was retaliation, understood she'd been targeted because of him. They grabbed her, yanked her from the vehicle, and she fought, screamed, struggled, but numbers overwhelmed her, and then everything went dark, chloroform or blow to the head, she didn't know, and when consciousness returned she was bound to a chair in a basement that smelled of mold and blood, and the man pacing in front of her wore expensive suit that contrasted sharply with his predatory smile. "So you're the woman who made Kang Min-ho lose his mind," he said in accented English, circling her like shark, and Amara's stomach dropped because she heard her death in his tone, understood she was bait, leverage, weapon to use against Min-ho, and fear wasn't just for herself anymore but for what he might do, what he might sacrifice to get her back, how this might destroy him. The hours that followed were nightmare, questions she couldn't answer, threats she tried to ignore, and pain when she refused to cooperate, nothing permanent but enough to terrify, enough to make her wonder if she'd survive this, and she thought about Min-ho, about the way he'd held her, the things he'd promised, the future they'd barely started building, and she clung to hope even as fear threatened to drown her. Rescue came with violence, explosive charges blowing the door, gunfire, and then he was there, covered in blood that probably wasn't his, eyes absolutely wild when they found her, and she'd never seen him like this, all control shattered, humanity stripped away to reveal the monster underneath, and he killed everyone who'd touched her, shot them without hesitation, without mercy, without anything except cold rage that should horrify her but instead made her feel avenged. He cut her free, hands shaking with aftermath adrenaline, and when he pulled her against him his grip was crushing, painful, perfect, and she felt him tremble, felt him bury his face in her hair, felt moisture that might have been tears, and she realized he'd been as terrified as her, maybe more, because she'd been afraid of dying but he'd been afraid of losing her, of living in a world where she didn't exist, and that fear had transformed him into something absolutely lethal. Mine. The word was ragged, repeated like mantra, and Amara held him back, ignored her injuries, her fear, everything except the need to comfort him, to prove she was alive, to reassure the man who'd torn through his enemies to reach her. He carried her out of that basement, wouldn't let anyone else touch her, and she registered dimly that his entire organization had mobilized, that he'd burned resources and called in favors and probably started a war to get her back, and the scope of it was terrifying and overwhelming and somehow exactly what she needed to believe this was real, that she mattered to him beyond passing fancy, that she'd become essential rather than temporary. Later that night, after hospitals and police and his lawyer making problems disappear, after everything calmed enough to breathe, he took her to his private residence, massive penthouse that reflected his power, and she thought he'd give her space, let her process, but instead he kept her close, hands constantly touching like he needed reassurance she was real, and when she finally broke down, tears and terror catching up, he held her through it, let her soak his shirt, whispered promises in Korean she didn't understand but felt anyway. The next morning brought reckoning, his world's retaliation swift and brutal, and she wasn't naive enough to ask questions, wasn't foolish enough to demand details, but she saw the news reports, the unexplained explosions, the rival organization mysteriously dissolving overnight, and she understood he'd made good on unspoken promises, had eliminated the threat so completely no one would dare target her again, had rewritten the power structure of Seoul's underworld because someone had touched what was his, and the possessiveness should bother her, the violence should disgust her, but instead she felt safe for the first time since arriving in this country, protected by a man whose love looked like warfare, whose devotion was measured in eliminated enemies, whose promises were kept through fear rather than flowers. They didn't discuss it, didn't acknowledge the bodies or the blood, just moved forward like they had all the time in the world, and maybe they did now, maybe he'd carved out space for them to exist, maybe love really did conquer everything when backed by sufficient firepower. By the end of the week Amara had moved into his penthouse officially, not because he demanded but because she couldn't stand being apart, couldn't sleep unless his arms were around her, couldn't breathe properly when distance separated them, and he'd been quietly moving her belongings for days anyway, anticipating her surrender, preparing space for her like he'd always known she'd stay. Her teaching position mysteriously transformed into something more flexible, better paid, and she suspected his influence but didn't protest because the new arrangement meant more time with him, meant she could build the life she'd dreamed of while being with the man who'd become her entire world in the space of weeks that felt like lifetimes. His penthouse was enormous, decorated in minimalist luxury that spoke of wealth beyond her comprehension, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering skyline, and he gave her free rein to change anything, encouraged her to make it theirs rather than his, and the casual way he integrated her into his space, his life, his world spoke louder than any declaration. The following morning she woke to find him watching her sleep, expression unguarded in a way he never allowed around others, and when she stirred his hand came up to trace her features with reverence that made her chest tight. Beautiful, he murmured, the English word carrying his accent, and Amara felt heat flood her system because he made her believe it, made her feel it, made her understand that to him she truly was beautiful exactly as she was, curves and all, dark skin and full features, everything she'd been taught to hide or minimize or apologize for transformed into assets by his appreciation. They made love slowly, morning light painting patterns across tangled limbs, and afterward he told her about his childhood, about parents who'd loved power more than their son, about expectations that had shaped him into something cold and controlled, about the loneliness of being untouchable, and she heard the vulnerability beneath his words, understood he was giving her pieces of himself he'd never shared, understood she'd become the person he trusted with truth rather than image. That evening he took her to meet his grandmother, the matriarch who'd actually raised him, and Amara's nervousness spiked because this was clearly important, clearly a statement about their relationship's permanence, clearly something he wouldn't do unless he intended forever. The elderly woman lived in a traditional hanok despite the family's wealth, surrounded by history and ceremony, and when she looked at Amara her eyes were sharp, assessing, missing nothing. "You're the one who broke my grandson," she said in surprisingly good English, and before Amara could panic she continued, "Good, he needed breaking, needed someone strong enough to crack that shell he built, needed someone real rather than the decorative women his position attracted." They had tea, conversations flowing between Korean and English, and his grandmother asked pointed questions about Amara's intentions, her strength, her ability to survive in a world that would judge her harshly for loving Minho, and Amara answered honestly, told her about fear and courage existing simultaneously, about choosing love despite risk, about refusing to shrink herself to fit others' expectations, and by the end his grandmother was smiling, nodding approval, touching Amara's hand with surprising warmth. Later that night Minho made love to her with intensity that bordered on desperation, and she felt the emotion beneath his control, understood meeting his grandmother had been significant in ways she didn't fully grasp, understood he'd been seeking blessing for something permanent. "Marriage," he said afterward, the word dropped into darkness like stone into still water. "I want to marry you, want to make this official, want the world to know you're mine and I'm yours," and Amara's breath caught because it was too soon, too fast, too everything except exactly what she wanted, and when she nodded, unable to form words, his kiss tasted like relief and possession and promises she knew he'd keep. The proposal should have terrified her, should have made her question the speed of their relationship, should have triggered every self-protection instinct she possessed, but instead she felt peace, felt rightness, felt like every painful moment of her life had been leading here, to this man, this love, this impossible connection that made sense despite defying logic. The following weeks blurred together, wedding planning that somehow happened around them rather than requiring their involvement, his grandmother and his assistant handling details while Minho focused on expanding legitimate business holdings, transitioning away from illegal operations not out of morality but because Amara had given him something worth protecting beyond power, beyond money, beyond the empire he'd built. She watched him transform, not completely, not losing the dangerous edge that made him effective, but softening in ways that surprised everyone except her, because she saw the man beneath the reputation, knew his capacity for tenderness matched his capacity for violence, understood both existed in service of the same fundamental drive, protecting what was his. Her family called, finally, mother's voice tight with disapproval when Amara mentioned the engagement, questioning her choices, reminding her about reputation, about how this would look, about marrying into danger, and Amara felt old insecurities rise before squashing them, before choosing herself, before explaining calmly that Minho was her choice and she didn't require approval, didn't need permission, was done living for others' comfort. The wedding was intimate despite the groom's status, held at his grandmother's hammock with traditional ceremony followed by modern celebration, and Amara wore white that made her dark skin glow, curves celebrated rather than hidden, and when Minho saw her his expression cracked, emotion bleeding through for everyone to witness, and she heard whispers, shock that Seoul's most controlled man was openly affected, clearly undone by his bride. The ceremony blended cultures, Korean and her heritage intertwined, and when they spoke vows his voice shook slightly, promising protection and devotion and love in ways that transcended language, and her response was equally emotional, promising partnership and trust and choosing him every day despite knowing his world's dangers, despite understanding what his protection cost, despite or maybe because of everything that made them impossible. The reception brought Seoul's elite, business associates, and political figures and people whose power she could feel like pressure, but Minho kept her close, hand never leaving her body, introducing her with pride that made her spine straighten, made her chin lift, made her understand she wasn't just his wife but his equal in ways that mattered. Later that night, alone finally, he carried her over the threshold of their bedroom with ceremony that made her laugh, made her feel cherished, and then he made love to her with reverence and hunger combined, taking his time, worshipping her body, making her come apart beneath him repeatedly until she was boneless and satisfied and completely his. Mine, he said afterward, the word that had become their foundation, and she repeated it back, yours, but you're mine too, equal claim, equal possession, equal ownership, and his smile was beautiful and dangerous and absolutely perfect. The honeymoon was private island, luxury, and isolation, 2 weeks of nothing except each other, and they spent hours talking, learning, building the foundation of their marriage, and she told him about her dreams, her fears, her hopes for their future, and he listened like every word was scripture, like she was prophet rather than wife, like her desires mattered as much as his, and that attention, that focus, that treatment like she was precious made her fall deeper, made her love expand beyond what she'd thought possible. They returned to Seoul to find his transition nearly complete, legitimate business thriving, illegal operations delegated to trusted people, and his focus shifted to building something lasting rather than something powerful, to creating legacy rather than empire, and Amara saw his grandmother's pleasure, understood he was finally becoming the man she'd hoped he'd be, understood love had accomplished what obligation never could. Amara's teaching career transformed into educational consulting, working with international schools, and she threw herself into work with passion Minho encouraged, proud of her accomplishments, never threatened by her success, never demanding she shrink to fit some traditional wife role, instead pushing her to excel, to build, to become everything she was capable of being. 3 months into marriage she realized her period was late, that exhaustion wasn't just from busy schedule, that certain smells made her nauseous, and terror and joy warred for dominance because they hadn't planned this, hadn't discussed children beyond vague someday, hadn't prepared for the reality of new life. The pregnancy test was positive, 3 of them actually, and Amara sat on their bathroom floor, staring at evidence, trying to organize feelings that ranged from ecstatic to terrified, wondering how to tell him, wondering if he'd be happy or feel trapped, wondering if this changed everything or nothing. She didn't have to wonder long because he found her there, took in the scene immediately, and his expression transformed, shock bleeding into something absolutely radiant, and then he was on the floor beside her, pulling her into his lap, hands shaking as they settled on her still flat stomach, and she felt moisture on her neck where his face was buried, felt him tremble, felt his absolute joy, and relief flooded her because he was happy, they were happy, this was right. A baby, his voice was wrecked, odd, beautiful, mine, ours, and she laughed through tears because of course that was his first coherent thought, possession and protection already extending to their unborn child, and she loved him more in that moment than she'd thought possible, loved him for his joy, his immediate acceptance, his absolute certainty that this was blessing rather than burden. The pregnancy was easy physically but emotionally complex, her body changing in ways that triggered old insecurities, weight gain that was necessary and healthy but still difficult, and some days she looked in the mirror and saw every criticism she'd ever received, every judgment about her body, every message that she was too much. Minho seemed to sense these moments with uncanny accuracy, would find her when doubt crept in, would kiss her growing belly with reverence, would tell her she was beautiful, would make love to her with worship that proved his words, would remind her that she was creating life, that her body was miraculous, that he'd never wanted her more than he did watching her grow with their child. His protectiveness intensified to almost comical levels, security tripled, her schedule monitored, certain foods banned, and she should probably find it suffocating but instead felt cherished, felt valued, felt like someone finally cared enough to be overbearing, and she'd spent so long being ignored that his attention felt like oxygen. 6 months pregnant she woke to cramping, spotting, and terror spiked through her system because she couldn't lose this baby, couldn't survive that loss, couldn't imagine telling Minho their child was gone. He was awake instantly, reading her panic, and before she could explain they were moving, him carrying her to the car, driving to hospital with speed that should have been illegal, and his hand gripped hers so tightly she felt bones grind but didn't protest because she needed the anchor, needed the connection, needed to believe everything would be okay. The hospital staff moved with urgency that confirmed her fears, and then doctors were examining her, speaking rapidly in Korean, and she couldn't understand, couldn't process, could only watch Minho's face for clues, and when his expression cracked she knew it was bad, knew they might lose everything, knew the universe was cruel enough to give them joy before snatching it away. But then the doctor smiled, said something that made Minho sag with relief, and Amara understood before translation that the baby was fine, that cramping was normal, that spotting could happen, that they'd scared themselves over something ultimately harmless. The relief was so intense she couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop shaking, and Minho held her through it, his own composure shattered, and she realized how terrified he'd been, how much this baby already meant to him, how thoroughly fatherhood had already claimed him despite the child not yet being born. That night he didn't sleep, just watched her, hand on her stomach, feeling their baby move, and she'd never seen him so vulnerable, so openly emotional, so completely stripped of the control that defined him, and she fell in love with him again, deeper, different, because she was seeing the father he'd become, the softness he'd found, the humanity he'd reclaimed through loving her. The remaining months passed in anticipation, nursery prepared, names debated, their families cautiously connecting, and Amara felt pieces of her life clicking into place, felt purpose beyond survival, felt joy that didn't come with conditions, felt loved in ways that healed wounds she'd carried for decades. Labor started 3 weeks early, contractions waking her at dawn, and Minho went absolutely white, transformed from controlled businessman to panicked expectant father in seconds, and despite the pain she laughed at him, at his obvious terror, at the way his hands shook as he helped her to the car. The hospital was prepared, his money and influence ensuring the best care, private suite, and team of specialists, but none of that mattered once contractions intensified, once pain became all-consuming, once she understood why women screamed during childbirth. He stayed beside her through all of it, let her crush his hand, didn't flinch when she cursed him for doing this to her, whispered encouragement in Korean and English, and she drew strength from his presence, from his absolute faith that she could do this, from his steady calm that anchored her when pain threatened to drown rational thought. Hours later their daughter was born, tiny and perfect and absolutely beautiful, and when the doctor placed her on Amara's chest the world stopped, restructured itself around this new reality, this person they'd created, this love that exceeded everything that had come before. Minho was crying openly, no shame, no control, just pure emotion as he touched their daughter's tiny hand, as she gripped his finger with surprising strength, as he looked between his wife and child with expression that rewrote Amara's understanding of love, because she'd thought what they had was everything, thought their connection was complete, but this expanded it beyond what she'd imagined possible. Perfect, he whispered, both of you, absolutely perfect, mine, and there was that word again, the one that had defined them from the beginning, but now it encompassed 3 instead of 2, now it meant family rather than just couple, now it represented future rather than just present. They named her May, chosen for meaning beautiful in Korean and fitting her perfectly, and Minho held her with terror and tenderness combined, clearly afraid of his own strength, clearly overwhelmed by responsibility, clearly transformed by fatherhood in ways that made Amara's heart overflow. The following weeks were exhausting, beautiful, impossible, new parents figuring out how to keep a tiny human alive while running on no sleep, and Amara had never been so tired or so happy, had never felt so needed or so fulfilled, had never understood love could expand infinitely rather than divide. Minho was devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor during midnight crying sessions, staring at May like she was miracle, which she was, and watching him with their daughter did things to Amara's heart, made her fall deeper, made her grateful for every moment that had led here, made her understand that the scared woman in that warehouse had found exactly what she'd been missing, home, family, love that didn't ask her to be smaller but instead gave her room to grow. His grandmother visited often, delighted by great-granddaughter, and one afternoon she pulled Amara aside, told her she'd been right about her strength, told her she'd saved Minho from becoming something irredeemable, told her she'd given their family something more valuable than power or money, she'd given them future, hope, redemption. And Amara cried because she'd spent her life being told she wasn't enough, and here was proof she was everything. 6 months after May's birth, Amara stood in their penthouse, daughter sleeping peacefully in nursery, husband working in home office, and looked out at Seoul's skyline, at the city that had been foreign and frightening when she'd arrived, that had almost killed her, that had given her everything. She thought about the woman she'd been, scared and small and certain she'd never matter, and compared her to the woman she'd become, loved and confident and building legacy, and the transformation was so complete she barely recognized herself. Her phone buzzed, message from her mother, first real communication since the wedding, words carefully neutral but containing olive branch, request to meet granddaughter, and Amara felt old wounds pulse but also felt strength, felt able to set boundaries, felt capable of allowing relationship on her terms rather than theirs, and she replied with invitation, with conditions, with clarity about what she'd accept and what she wouldn't, and the power of that, of choosing herself, of protecting her family, felt revolutionary. That evening Minho found her lost in thought, pulled her against his chest, asked what was occupying her mind, and she told him about her mother, about fear and hope tangled together, about wanting May to know her grandmother but also needing to protect her from judgment, and he listened with patience that still surprised her, with understanding that came from his own complicated family, and then he told her he'd support whatever she decided, that he trusted her judgment, that he'd protect both her and May from anyone who brought pain, family included, and that unconditional support, that absolute faith, made her brave enough to try. The meeting happened the following week, her mother flying to Seoul, and Amara felt 14 again, desperate for approval, but then Minho's hand found hers, May made content sounds in her arms, and she remembered she wasn't that girl anymore, wasn't seeking validation, was offering opportunity for relationship rather than begging for acceptance, and the power dynamic shifted, became something healthier, something mutual, something built on respect rather than obligation. Her mother held May with wonder, made comments about how beautiful she was, how perfect, and Amara waited for criticism, for judgment, for the inevitable mention of weight or choices or disappointment, but it never came, and she realized her mother was trying, was making effort, was attempting to build bridge rather than wall, and Amara decided to meet her halfway, to forgive if not forget, to allow relationship while maintaining boundaries, and it wasn't perfect but it was progress, and sometimes progress was enough. That night Minho made love to her with tenderness that destroyed her, told her he was proud of her, told her she was stronger than she knew, told her watching her grow, watching her heal, watching her become the woman she was always meant to be had been his privilege, and she cried because he saw her, really saw her, and being seen, being known, being loved anyway was everything she'd ever wanted and never thought she'd find. 2 years after they'd met, Amara stood in the same warehouse where it had all started, the space transformed now, renovated into legitimate storage for Minho's businesses, no trace of the violence that had occurred here, and she thought about that night, about terror and attraction combined, about the moment their eyes had met and everything had changed. Minho appeared behind her, arms wrapping around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder, and she leaned back into him, comfortable in ways that came from time and trust and choosing each other daily. "Remember," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear, "how I said you were mine before I even knew your name?" And she smiled because yes, she remembered thinking he was insane, remembered being terrified and attracted in equal measure, remembered the moment she'd decided to trust him despite every logical reason not to. "Best decision I ever made," she said, meaning it, meaning all of it, the fear and the faith and the leap into unknown that had given her everything, and his arms tightened, agreement without words, and they stood there in the space where their story had started, grateful for every moment, every choice, every risk that had led them here. Later that month Minho surprised her with gallery showing, her photography displayed professionally, the hobby she'd mentioned once transformed into exhibition, and she walked through the space seeing her vision celebrated, seeing her talent recognized, seeing proof that he listened to everything she said, remembered everything she wanted, supported dreams she'd barely articulated. The opening was packed, Sol's elite attending because he'd ensured they did, and she stood there, curvy black woman from nowhere, being celebrated by people who'd normally ignore her, and she felt pride, felt accomplishment, felt like she'd earned this rather than just benefiting from his influence, because the photos were good, were meaningful, were worthy regardless of whose wife she was. That night he made love to her surrounded by her art, told her he'd never been more proud, told her watching her shine was better than any success he'd achieved, told her she made him want to be worthy of her, and she laughed because he'd had it backwards from the beginning, she was the one trying to be worthy of him, but maybe that was love, two people convinced they'd gotten the better deal, both determined to deserve the other. 3 years into marriage Amara was pregnant again, this time planned and anticipated, and Minho was somehow even more attentive than the first time, more protective, more devoted, more obviously besotted, and she teased him about it, about his hovering, but secretly loved it, loved being cherished, loved having someone care this much. The pregnancy was harder this time, complications that required bed rest, and she chafed against restrictions, against helplessness, against depending on others, but Minho was patient, was present, took time off work to care for her, and she fell in love with him again, differently, deeper, because crisis revealed character and his was beautiful. Their son was born healthy despite concerns, another perfect addition, and May was delighted by her brother, gentle and careful in ways that made Amara's heart overflow, and watched